Thanks so much and welcome. I know as folks are coming in, you might just miss their introduction, but that's okay. Welcome. I'm Deborah Pearlstein. I'm a professor at Cardozo Law School, and I co-direct our Floersheimer Center for Constitutional Democracy here. So thank you all for joining us. And I am thrilled to welcome today for our book talk, Adam Jentleson, who is the author of this fascinating book, which I have here, and you all should get as well, called Kill Switch: The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. So a few small things to talk about, one or two anyway, for today. I should introduce Mr. Jentleson, and I'll call you Adam if that's okay with you, by saying that he has a fascinating background as a veteran campaign staffer for Democratic campaigns and speechwriters, which is a former job close to my heart. But maybe most relevant here, Adam came to serve in the Senate beginning in 2011 as Deputy Chief of Staff for then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, a Democratic senator from Nevada, an experience that, it becomes apparent from, I think, reading the book, clearly shaped his thinking about the role of the filibuster today, and I'll ask him about the extent to which it shaped his thinking about what we should do about it going forward. The filibuster itself, obviously much in the news of late, as it has become very apparent that the new Biden administration has a robust legislative agenda, passing things from economic stimulus and infrastructure bills to, it appears, right, an agenda that includes everything from immigration and criminal justice reform and voting rights legislation on deck. But of course, an extremely closely divided, indeed evenly divided, Senate, making passage certainly not at all certain. And it's in part, clearly, this current political moment that is motivating this enormous interest in and discussion in Washington and beyond about whether or not it is time to get rid of the filibuster or not in order to secure passage of Biden's agenda or the current agenda. But others, even within the Democratic Party, are not sure that this is the right course of action. Particularly not to the extent that the filibuster is thought of as one of these sort of enduring democratic or enduring norms, in any event, of Senate procedure. So that's absolutely part of what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to start with some nuts and bolts to help us bring that up to speed. But I should say, and then I'm going to stop talking and start asking questions, obviously, this arises in a much broader context as well, not just the current political moment and the particular policy agenda items that are being debated in Washington right now, but it seems to be, and I think Adam's book suggests, right, that the filibuster is one pretty important barometer of the health of our constitutional democracy more broadly. And while it is true, as we've been talking about at the center and in our classes and elsewhere all year, we had a free and fair election in November 2020, and the remarkable insurrection at the Capitol did not succeed on January 6th. And indeed, there is a new presidential administration in office. Can we worry a little bit less about the fate of democracy and the threat of authoritarian governance in the United States? Or is there more yet to talk about? So it's in that context that I want to welcome Adam, thank him again, and now to the grilling, if I can. But let me just start by asking, before we get into this, I want to understand a little bit what led you to write this book in the first place. And it seemed to me from the book that part of it was driven by your experience in the Senate. So what does it mean to be Deputy Chief of Staff to the Senate Majority Leader? What was your day job? What did you do for a living during those years?
Sure. And thank you so much, Deborah, for having me here. It's such a great pleasure to talk to you and talk to this group. So I came up through the communication side of things. So I was communications director before I was deputy chief. And so a lot of my role was overseeing the communications side of things. And I think, and then sort of the political portfolio for what Senator Reid did in his job as majority leader. As majority leader, I mean, I think this may be obvious, but I'll walk it through. I mean, you're basically responsible for everything that happens on the Senate floor. One of the things I talk about in the book is how this came to be. The job of majority leader was never really supposed to exist. You know, in the House, the Speaker of the House is a position created by the Constitution, but the Senate doesn't. The Constitution doesn't say anything about the Senate in terms of leaders, and in fact, there was no majority leader position until the 1920s, and that was by design. It was supposed to be sort of a leaderless body, but today it has evolved from this sort of place that's supposed to be sort of horizontally organized to an extremely top-down way of doing things. And how we got from there to here is part of what I explain in the book. But now the Senate majority leader is responsible for every single thing that happens on the floor. And their primary power comes from setting the agenda, and that is basically deciding what bills come to the floor and when. That may not sound like a lot of power, but it actually is, because you are essentially deciding the fate of the nation's agenda. And then obviously part of your job is to try to get the votes to pass those bills. So when I was there, I was working for Senator Reid, and my job would be to help set that agenda, decide, give my input into what I thought we should prioritize, particularly from a communication standpoint, but also from a political perspective. And then when we would bring a bill to the floor, a big part of my job was to shape the debate about that bill. And working in the Capitol is a lot of fun because unlike a lot of other jobs, you are very much sort of, it's almost like a wild, wild west. Maybe I shouldn't use those sort of phrases in light of January 6th, but it is a free and open place. And again, I think after January 6th, this is less so. The security is much more intense. And also you have the COVID conditions. But before all of that kicked in, you go through a little bit of security to get into the Capitol. And then once you're in, you have to have a pass and all that stuff visible, but you basically can roam around. And so all of the reporters who cover the Senate are just sort of roaming through the halls, getting coffee at the cafeteria, getting lunch. And so are the senators. You'll go down to get, something there was a little takeout window 2 floors below our office. You go down there to grab, a burger or something, and you run into a senator waiting in line for their hamburger. And then while they're waiting in line, a reporter walks up to them and asks them a question. And then, you eavesdrop and hear what the senator's saying to that reporter. I mean, it's a very open environment. In the White House, all the reporters are sort of penned into one area. When they speak to White House staff, it's usually in the form of the formal briefing that we see every day. And there's much less interaction. On a campaign trail, it's sort of similar. The press are on a bus and they, follow the candidate around. But what I really loved about working there was that very open interaction. And it was, a very free give and take. Reporters are extremely smart people. And what I particularly liked about my job was having to sort of be a generalist and get, up to speed on whatever issue we were bringing to the floor at the time. I think the press gets a bad rap sometimes, but their questions tend to be very substantive. So if we were debating, an immigration policy, I had to become an expert on immigration and be able to answer all the questions about every in and out of this bill. So, that was basically what I did. I shaped the debate on those bills. I got to know the bills, and I helped us devise strategy about which bills to bring to the floor and how to talk about them, and how to persuade people to come join us, somewhat successfully on occasion.
So that's great and really interesting explanation that helps put us there, I think, a little bit. So before we back up and figure out how we got here, let me ask one other question about that experience, which is, in your experience, and I take it to be substantially the same still today, how does when I say somebody's going to filibuster a piece of legislation, how does that actually work? What needs to happen? If some senator wakes up in the morning and says, I don't like this legislation, I want to filibuster, what needs to happen? What does that mean in real terms in the sort of current Senate?
Very little needs to happen. It's basically expected at this point that someone will filibuster a bill. Before any bill is brought to the floor, the cloak room. So the cloak rooms are the little, literally cloak rooms off of the Senate floor. There's one for Democrats and one for Republicans. When you're watching the Senate floor on C-SPAN, there's sort of double doors that ring on every wall of the chamber. Two of those sets of double doors go to one goes to the Republican cloakroom, one goes to the Democratic cloakroom. The cloakroom staff sort of operate as the sort of like clerks of the Senate, but for their side. So you have a Democratic cloakroom staff and a Republican cloakroom staff. When a bill comes to the floor, the cloakroom staff sends an email to every office on their side, so all Democratic offices in our case, and it's called a hotline. And you get this email that is in all caps that says hotline, S, and then you get the bill number, and that means that bill is going to get brought to the floor. Theoretically, if no one were to raise any objections to that bill being brought to the floor, that bill could come up for debate and then go to a vote on a majority rule basis all the way through. Right now, the Senate rules still hold that bills pass or fail, that the vote for final passage on bills is a majority. Instead, what happens is inevitably some office sends an email back to that hotline email that says, my boss objects. And that's all it takes. And that email is what raises the threshold for passing that bill effectively from a simple majority to 60. Because what that email is saying is, in effect, my boss is claiming their right to unlimited debate. That is every senator's right in the Senate. In the past, that would then require them to there would be no email, first of all, but if a senator wanted to claim their right to unlimited debate, they would have to actually go to the floor and debate. Now, the claiming of the right to debate has been divorced from any actual debate whatsoever. Really what they're doing is not claiming their right to debate, but they just want to raise the threshold. They just want to raise it from a majority to 60. So it is that email and that claiming of that right that is recognized by this evolution in Senate norms and traditions as effectively a filibuster. So they don't actually have to appear on the floor. They don't have to explain themselves in public. They don't have to do anything except send that email. And that automatically raises the threshold to 60. To the extent that the filibuster has some merit and that defenders of the filibuster would say it is designed to give the minority a say in the debate and allow their voices to be heard, that doesn't even happen right now because someone just sends that email, it goes up to 60, and then nobody ever bothers to come to the floor and actually claim that right to debate. So that is how a filibuster works today. It looks nothing like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's much quieter, but also much more powerful because, Mr. Smith eventually collapsed in the movie, right? And he, stopped talking and then the bill would have come up for a vote. But for those of us who have, or those of you, I saw the movie. I thought it was brilliant. Great classic film. I think black and white must have been, right? Jimmy Stewart 1939.
is this great noble congressman who goes to Washington and tries to defend the little guy against the big interests and ultimately collapses in the weight of doing the filibuster. It's worth rewatching, especially in this era. But it makes me want to now go back, not just to Jimmy Stewart, but farther than that, right? And I check the Constitution regularly. It's sort of an occupational hazard here at the law school. I am really confident that filibuster is not in Article 1 or indeed anywhere in the Constitution. Did the framers, so I want to understand how we got here, but I want to back up for just a minute to get back to where we are. Did the framers of the Constitution sort of contemplate that there would be, for certain kinds of legislation, they contemplate the filibuster as such, right? Unlimited debate. They contemplate that there would be a supermajority requirement for certain kinds of legislation. Was this, is there record of this actually being discussed at the founding? Do we know what they would have said about it?
Right. Yes, they did contemplate it and they decided against it. And there's a very clear record of this. And this is a little bit awkward for me. I'm not an originalist. But I look at this more as a question of system design and, a system that was designed to be able to change and adapt that is currently being blocked from doing that because of this clog that's been put into it by the filibuster. So, but there is an extremely clear record of this. And just to sort of get at their motivations here, when they designed the Articles of Confederation, some of the same people, they did put in place a supermajority threshold. And they did it for the reasons that defenders of the filibuster defend it today, which is they thought that that would promote consensus and compromise. What they found in practice was that it promoted gridlock. And it was one of the main reasons that system of government proved ineffective. So when they went to design the Constitution, they had just had firsthand experience with what a legislature looks like when you put a supermajority threshold into
in the Articles of Confederation government, you mean?
Correct. Yeah. Yes, that's right. And so they said explicitly, we're not doing that again. And they enumerated a small handful of cases in the Constitution where they thought a supermajority requirement should be necessary. And those were extraordinary cases, such as amending the Constitution or removing an elected official from office. But for everything else, they made very clear that it should be majority rule. And this isn't just sort of the absence of a rule. They discussed this explicitly in the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 22 took on the arguments for a supermajority, and he said, what at first might appear a remedy is in fact a poison. Speaking of the supermajority, he said, and then went on to sort of list all the arguments in favor of the supermajority, and then went on to debunk them one by one and say this isn't what happens. What it really does is promote gridlock, essentially. In Federalist 10, James Madison, that's often cited by conservatives for Madison's defense of minority rights, which he does do in Federalist 10. But if you read the argument all the way through, he lays out why it's important to allow the minority to have their say. But then he says, after the minorities had their say, the majority should be allowed to rule. He calls majority rule the Republican principle, and says that that's at the heart of government. So they were really trying to strike a delicate balance where the minority would be allowed to have input in the process and to have a say, but they were very aware of the dangers of obstruction with the supermajority threshold. So they made very clear that after the minority had a chance to debate for a while, and the other checks they put into the system, like longer terms for senators, statewide electorate, having only 1/3 of the body up for election at any given time, all those checks were supposed to have a moderating influence. And at the end of the day, they wanted the Senate to remain majority rule when the decision point was when it was time to make a decision on a bill. And they did indeed actually have a rule in the original Senate that would allow a majority to cut off any debate if it became obstructive. That rule got erased from the books in 1806 in a sort of rewriting and consolidating of the Senate's rules that happened at the recommendation of Vice President Aaron Burr. This was back in the day when the Vice President presided over the Senate every day. And the reason they got rid of it is because obstruction wasn't a problem. For the first half century in the Senate's existence, there was virtually no obstruction. People adhered to the norms and rules. It was considered beneath the dignity of a senator to obstruct. There were only 24 of them, 26 of them sitting around in a room together, and they would just talk. And when one guy had finished having their say, the next guy would go. So obstruction just was not an issue. And it didn't become one until later in the 19th century. And we can talk about that more, but I just wanted to, stop there in your question, which is, did they consider it? And the answer is yes, they did. And no, and they explicitly said that they didn't want anything like this to ever exist.
Okay, so that's really helpful and makes me wish for like an Act 1.5 of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, where they actually rap about what's the content of Federalist 10 and Federalist 22, among others. But I'm short of that. So that makes sense, but obviously something changes. It's one thing to have that view in a Senate where Thomas Jefferson is literally writing the rules of procedure, Senate procedure, and everybody's sort of, the way we settle differences in the most extreme form is this very formal sort of duel, which is the height of barbarism at some level, but is still pretty formal, right? Everybody's behaving sort of well. At some point, this changes. What drives the change and why? Do people just start talking indefinitely and it becomes really irritating, or what happens?
Right. And so one of the arguments you'll hear from defenders is that, okay, so fine, the framers didn't want it, that's clear. But then we have 200 years of sort of history and practice, and through the course of that time, the Senate decided as a body that it did want to have this thing. And, the Senate is allowed to change. And this is the received wisdom now of of that evolution. But the problem with that argument is that it didn't really ever decide that this is what it wanted. And in fact, as it started to evolve in this direction, you had consistent efforts to stop it, and to stop the filibuster from coming into existence, led by some of the leading lights of the Senate, starting with Henry Clay. And often you had instances where it was clear that a majority of the Senate wanted to reform and to stop the filibuster from coming into existence. But for a variety of reasons, part of it is the general asymmetry of the filibuster. It sort of slowly was allowed to come into existence. In short, because the people who wanted to birth it into the world often were more passionate about that than the people who wanted to stop it. I'll pick one example. So to your question, when did it start? Well, the main progenitor of it was John Calhoun of South Carolina, who was sort of the spiritual godfather of the Confederacy, one of the really most virulent racists in a time when, you know, pretty much everybody was pretty racist. But this is a guy who went to the floor of the Senate and gave an extensive speech in 1836 about how slavery was not a necessary evil, but in fact a positive good. Those were his words. So real bad guy. Ironically, a guy who started his career as a firm unionist. This was something I did not realize about Calhoun before I did the research for the book. But he was basically a political opportunist. He started as a unionist. He wanted to use federal power to bring military installations and federal spending to the South. That was his vision for how the South would succeed. And then he had a series of falling outs with the different administrations he served. He first served as vice president to Adams, and had a falling out with Adams. Then he fell in with Andrew Jackson and was widely seen as a potential successor to Andrew Jackson. But then he had a falling out with Andrew Jackson over what was called the Petticoat Affair, which is a very fascinating episode in American history. But he couldn't seem to stop having these falling outs with these powerful people, and kept finding himself more and more on the outs. And so that's what sort of led him to factionalism and sectionalism. And then he sort of started pioneering this theory for why the minority should be allowed to nullify the verdicts of the federal government, you know, sometimes in the form of the state itself. Nullification was something he came up with before he got to the Senate. But then once he got to the Senate, he sort of translated that theory into Senate terms and said, well, you know, if a minority of senators don't like what the majority is doing, they should be allowed to exercise a veto over that process. And there was this brief period where Madison and Calhoun were both alive at the same time. And Madison was asked to respond to some of the theories that Calhoun was putting forth, and if he agreed with them, because sometimes Calhoun would sort of invoke Madison and the protection of the minority in his arguments. And Madison made clear in his letters and correspondence at this time that he disagreed vehemently, basically restating the case he made in Federalist 10 that he thought the minority should be allowed to have a role, but at the end of the day, the majority should rule. And then Calhoun made his own views explicit in his Disquisition on Government that was published right after his death in 1850. And in that, he explicitly stated that he didn't think that Madison's system provided enough power to the minority, and explicitly thought that he thought the minority should be able to have a veto power. So I think of this as sort of voice versus veto, right? Madison wanted the minority to have a voice. Calhoun wanted the minority to have a veto. And Calhoun was able to start shifting the system towards his vision starting in the 1830s. The way he did this was by inventing what we would today consider the talking filibuster, which was, you know, basically going to the floor, a senator or a group of senators, and talking at length to delay a bill. And the example that I said I was going to use a while ago, I'll get to that. So in 1841, Calhoun starts doing one of these talking filibusters. And as I said before, this was a time when obstruction was still very rare. And the senators had never really seen anything like this. There were a few scattered instances of filibusters before this, and historians and political scientists disagree about exactly when the first one was. But when you think of it sort of having all of the features that we think of today in the filibuster, this 1841 filibuster is a good candidate for the first one, because it was obstruction used in defense of minority rights, in the talking filibuster style that sort of became the norm. And so Henry Clay is trying to advance a bill to reauthorize the Bank of the United States. And Calhoun rises in opposition, and he and his allies go off, and they basically for 3 weeks or so are able to block this bill that Henry Clay is trying to advance. the coverage of this at the time is breathless. People can't believe what's happening. Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri at the time has an extensive first person account of this, where you can sort of feel his excitement. He was an ally of Calhoun's, and he had this phrase where he said, "We were victorious in the midst of unbroken defeats." They kept losing, but they were thrilled by the fact that they could make the life of the majority hard and difficult and delay. And so Clay, in response to this, is horrified, and he immediately sees how dangerous this tactic could be for the Senate in imposing gridlock on this institution that he cared about. And so Clay immediately moves to try to reform Senate rules and stop this filibuster from even coming into existence. Specifically, what he tries to do is to restore that rule to cut off debate that had been gotten rid of in 1806 under the reorganization under Aaron Burr. So in modern parlance, that would be what we would call going nuclear, in this hyperbolic term that people use today. But literally, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, was the very first person to try to go nuclear. So all that is to say, this idea that this, maybe it wasn't in the founding, but then the Senate sort of decided to embrace this over time, isn't really true either. Calhoun was able to outmaneuver Clay in this instance and basically force him to choose between this sort of more abstract goal of Senate reform or his immediate legislative priority, the bank bill. And Clay chose the bank bill because that was what he cared about more, in terms of delivering for the administration. And I think that's one of the patterns you would see over time, is that the filibusterers were often able to at least maneuver their opponents into making a sort of a Sophie's choice about what do you want? Do you want to deliver on your top legislative priority, or do you want to pursue reform, which could be a quagmire? In most cases, they ended up choosing their legislative priority. So I just wanted to bring that up to say that even as the filibuster started to come into existence, the Senate often was horrified at what was happening to it and tried to reform it, and just sort of was never able to quite get there.
So that's fascinating history, and Calhoun's role in particular, right? So famously, as you point out, John C. Calhoun, Southern, virulent racist, Confederate ultimately, and had this theory that he advances in the Senate and out of state nullification, that a state that doesn't like a state in his world, a Southern state that doesn't like what the federal government is doing or making it do or deciding, can simply ignore what the federal or nullify or veto the federal government's law, right? The sort of opposite of what we think about now as federal supremacy or federal preemption of state laws, right? Calhoun's view was it should be the other way around. And obviously, right, this is the period you're describing is in the lead up to the Civil War. Then there's the Civil War. But I take your book to be making the case that one of the things that sustains the filibuster, one of the things that drives the interest in the filibuster is not just Calhoun in the first instance, right, but the interest of Southern states, and who were then Southern Democrats throughout this period of time, to prevent the development of civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation, sort of before the Civil War, but and more significantly going into the 19th and 20th centuries.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if white supremacy did not have such a powerful motivating force for many senators of the time, the filibuster probably would have been reformed long ago and gotten rid of. But decade after decade, white supremacy proved to be such a powerful motivating factor for senators that it was able to motivate them like nothing else. I mean, look, the talking filibuster back in the day was hard to do. You had to spend a lot of energy to wage one. You had to be on the floor. You had to coordinate. You had to constantly keep control of the floor. So it took a lot of physical energy, coordination, and effort. And the only thing that consistently provided senators enough motivation to wage the talking filibuster during the Jim Crow era in particular was white supremacy. And so, this is an interesting period because this is also when the filibuster started to acquire the ability to impose a supermajority threshold. And when you look at the senators of this period, I mean, they were explicit about the fact that this tool was the thing they cared the most about. Richard Russell was the leader of the Southern Bloc starting in the 1930s and then all the way through the 1960s. He led the filibuster against the 1964 Civil Rights Bill that was eventually defeated by Lyndon Johnson. And so
eventually enacted.
Yes, that's right. The filibuster is right. Right. The
Yeah.
bill was enacted. The filibuster was defeated. Russell made no bones about the fact that white supremacy was his leading motivation. He said at one point that any Southern man worth a pinch of salt would give his all to maintain white supremacy. He was Lyndon Johnson's mentor. And essentially responsible for Lyndon Johnson's rise from the Senate. Lyndon Johnson arrived in the Senate in 1848, became minority leader by 1952. That is unheard of in terms of speed rising through the Senate, and that was all because of Richard Russell. And when Johnson got to the Senate in his maiden speech in 1949, he wanted to, essentially kiss up to the Southern Bloc and to Richard Russell as much as he could. So his maiden speech, which he gave a copy of to Russell ahead of time, was about the importance of the filibuster and specifically its importance in blocking civil rights legislation. Richard Russell testified at a Rules Committee hearing in 1949. There was a big debate over the rules that was going on at this time, and there was a bipartisan coalition again in favor of reforming the filibuster and basically getting rid of it. This happened consistently throughout Senate history. And Richard Russell went to this hearing on what should happen in the filibuster, and he testified under oath that the filibuster was the most important, maintenance of the filibuster was the most important priority, and specifically that the reason he wanted the filibuster to remain was to block civil rights. So there's really, again, no ambiguity here. This was simply a given at the time. And it was the filibuster that Southerners used to block every civil rights bill that came before the Senate from the end of Reconstruction up until 1964. And I just want to make one point here, because sometimes we're sort of told that the filibuster has this cooling saucer role, and perhaps America wasn't ready for action on civil rights until 1964, and maybe there was some wisdom in that delay. And I would push back very hard against that, and that's came up in the research I did for the book. The fact is that America, by all appearances, was ready for action on civil rights long before 1964. There was majority support to pass bills to end poll taxes, to end lynching, and to end workplace discrimination as early as 1891. Bills to do these things started to pass the House of Representatives often starting in the 1920s. They would come over to the Senate, where they clearly had majority support. And they had presidents of both parties who were on record willing to sign them if they came to their desks. Gallup came into existence as a polling organization in the 1930s. It polled the public on federal anti-lynching laws in 1937. And in 1937, Gallup found 72% of the American people in support of federal anti-lynching laws, including a majority in the South. It polled on anti-poll tax laws in the 1940s, and it found upwards of 60% of the American people in support of anti-poll tax laws. So the country was ready for action on civil rights. It's pretty depressing to think about the cost in human suffering and lives that was incurred over those several decades that we failed to pass those bills. But the only reason we didn't pass them was because of the filibuster in the Senate. During this period, every single other bill, not counting treaties, but every other regular piece of legislation that came before the Senate was allowed to pass or fail on a majority vote basis. Only a few ran into filibusters, and those that did were resolved very quickly. It was only civil rights bills that were consistently forced to clear this new supermajority threshold, and only civil rights bills that were killed by the filibuster from 1877 with the end of Reconstruction until 1964.
That's an extraordinary statistic. Okay, so I want to fast forward a bit because I want us to be able to get to what do we do now. I think it's critical to know this piece of history, but at some point, a couple of things happen, right? At some point, number one, it goes from this talking filibuster to I can do this by sending an email. And now everybody assumes it takes 60 votes to pass out anything in the Senate, because it takes 60 votes to cut off debate. You don't even have to go there. You just send an email, as you pointed out, right? So at some point that shifts. And at some point this becomes much more, right? This becomes the norm as opposed to this exceptional, we'll just use it for civil rights legislation, which is a little bit troubling enough. But I have this sense and sort of memory that this goes into overdrive, even before looking at your book, right? But you talk about this there as well. This goes into overdrive, and you tell me when, the 1990s, the 2000s, something categorically changes relatively recently in our lifetimes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, there was a steady, so basically what happened after 1964, so it was interesting. Observers at the time Roger Mudd talks about this in his autobiography. Roger Mudd sort of made his career making moment was reporting on the 1964 filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill. He was his producers told him to do this on the Capitol steps, and he was like, "Nobody's going to care about this. This is dumb." But it was his nightly reports from the Capitol steps that sort of captured the nation's attention and vaulted his career. And he writes about how at the time, once that filibuster was broken, everybody thought, "Okay, well, that's the end of the filibuster. It's this racist tool. It's going to go away, and civil rights is proceeding." But instead, the opposite happened, and it sort of became normalized. It was sort of like a brand name drug losing its becoming generic. And the thing was that, it had this association with white supremacy, and before that had caused senators to not want to use it. But once it started to lose that association, other senators, opportunistically thought to themselves, well, this thing is pretty powerful. And what if I used it for my top priority? And so slowly over decades, they sort of started to use it more on other issues. But I just want to underscore that there was never like an affirmative decision to do this. This was, again, a minority of senators, one senator here, another senator there, starting to sort of experiment with, well, what if I use this tool? Is there going to be a backlash? Am I going to regret it? And it took time for them to sort of see that actually you could use it. There were some particular practitioners during this time. This one senator, James Allen of Alabama, was a real pain in his colleagues. He was sort of the Ted Cruz of the time. He was a mentor to Jesse Helms, who Ted Cruz has said he has modeled himself after. James Allen didn't care about being on committees, didn't really care about getting anything done, just wanted to mess with people. And so he used the filibuster all the time. And there were some efforts at reform in the 1970s in response to that. But basically, you see a slow rise starting in the 1970s, a little bit more in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, it's sort of, a few dozen times a year. But it sort of stayed within, if you look at the chart, it's sort of in the 40 to 60 range for every 2-year session of Congress through the 90s and into the early aughts. But then if you look at the chart, it sort of goes like this. And then when Mitch McConnell takes over as majority leader, it goes like this. It literally doubled from the year before he became minority leader to his first session in Congress as minority leader. And what McConnell did that was his sort of key strategic insight was that he realized that, or at least he wanted to sort of test the proposition, what happens if you just filibuster everything? Not just big pieces of legislation, not just sort of, major nominees, but what if I apply this 60 vote threshold to literally everything the Senate does, from major pieces of legislation to routine business? And at the time, there were a lot of people who thought the strategy would backfire. They thought Republicans would be seen as obstructionist. Back in 2009, after Obama was elected and was riding high in approvals, there was a lot of talk of the Republicans being the party of no. And the idea was that this would be bad for them. And so McConnell sort of, pioneered this strategy in light of overcoming some opposition, even with his own party. And his strategic bet was that blame for obstruction would fall on the party in power, and that Republicans would have a relatively easy time avoiding blame for it because voters don't have a lot of patience, and they think if you're in power, you should do the things you promised, and if you don't come to me with excuses about how it's the other guy's fault. And he had strategic courage in a way to pioneer this strategy and to give it a shot and risk that backlash. McConnell is someone who has very high risk tolerance, and that is in a lot of ways what makes him a very effective leader. And so he tried it, and it worked. And Republicans, had a massive success in the 2010 midterms, took back the House. They won. We thought 2018 was a blue wave with Democrats winning 40 seats. In 2010, Republicans won 53 seats. It was a massive wave. And so there just was no way to argue that his strategy wasn't successful. And so it really was McConnell's leadership where the filibuster takes on this entirely new cast, going from, starting to be used for big ticket items to just being used on everything that the Senate did.
Okay, so I want to get into, right, if that's the case of how we got here. And to be clear, right, as this begins to be used, it's used by Republicans and Democrats, right, in the beginning in the 1970s and through up to the Mitch McConnell period, and still, right, beyond. when they're in control, at least on occasion, on a variety of issues. So there's filibustering going on sort of to some extent on both sides of the aisle. Although, as you point out, there's this huge sort of cascade when McConnell takes over as majority leader. So, and I kind of intuit from what you've said, both in the sense of the role of majority, the sense of the importance of majority rule in a democracy, and in particular, this history of sort of voting rights, and not just voting rights, but individual rights suppression, that this has got to go. So let me play devil's advocate, because the first argument is, or maybe the second argument, right? The first argument against doing this is if you get rid of the filibuster now, which in principle you could do by 51 votes, right? By changing the Senate rule by 51 votes about how many votes it takes to end debate, then you remove this tool for everyone going forward. So when there is Republican control in the Senate and in the House, and then the next Republican in the White House, if they decide they want to repeal the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or pass legislation banning abortion across the country, or whatever is on the progressive sort of fear list, right, of worst possible, the Democrats will have no tool to block it either. Now, what, so is it really worth it from that point of view? I mean, isn't there something to Madison's tyranny of the majority kind of concern, even if he wouldn't have supported the filibuster as such?
Right. Yes, and this is obviously, yes, this question comes up, every time, and for understandable reasons. It is scary to think about, with the Republican Party taking this extreme turn. It is scary for progressives like myself to think about what they would do if they had simple majority rule. But I have a couple responses to it. And the first and sort of most important to me is that, this is a rule that anyone can get rid of. And so when Mitch McConnell is back in control, or another Republican Senate leader, the first time they want to get rid of it, they can just get rid of it themselves. And so, you have to decide, there are several things that Democrats are not going to be able to pass in the next 2 years if they don't get rid of the filibuster. And let's take voting rights and HR 1 as sort of the central example. There's a lot of debate about what you can pass through this tool called reconciliation, but there's no way you can, it has relatively narrow rules. You can argue on the margins. It can be stretched for this and that, but there's no question that you cannot stretch it far enough to pass any sort of civil rights bill, voting rights, HR 1, anything on that front. So, what you'd be doing is you'd making a strategic calculation that Democrats should forego the passage of things like that now, in order to preserve a defensive tool later. And the reason I think that is not the right calculation is that you're incurring an enormous cost now, and frankly, a cost that will make it easier for Republicans to get back in power. And then you're hoping to preserve a tool that Republicans can just get rid of whenever they want. So I think that that's probably not the right way to go. And in fact, I would argue that it's even riskier to not pass the things we know we can pass now, and then just hope that Republicans don't get rid of the filibuster and pass all the things that they want to pass later. McConnell didn't, he got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees in 2017 when it advantaged him. He could have gotten rid of the filibuster for legislation also when he was in power, but there wasn't ever really anything that was in high demand by the Republican base, where he was under a lot of pressure to get rid of it. You never saw that. Trump sent a couple tweets saying, hey, McConnell, get rid of the filibuster, but there was never any sustained pressure. So I think the sort of thought experiment to do is say, what about when, let's say, Republicans are back in control of all three elected branches? The Republican president has something he really wants to pass. The House of Representatives passes it. It comes over to the Senate. It's clear it can get 50 plus, but not 60. What does McConnell do in that situation? I think the safe bet is that he gets rid of the filibuster and passes it. You can make an argument that's not in his interest, but the central organizing principle in McConnell's life is his preservation of his own political power and his own political survival. And whenever the base is demanding that he do something, he always does it. So, so that's my main response. I mean, there's sort of more philosophical responses. This is a structural tool that on a structural level advantages the conservative side of the spectrum more than the progressive side. It it makes it harder to pass things. So it makes it easier for the party that, William F. Buckley's phrase that stands athwart history yelling stop, makes it easier for them to stop things. And historically, it has been used far more consistently, not just on civil rights, but since then, far more consistently to benefit conservative causes than to benefit progressive ones. So even if it occasionally comes in handy for progressives, the strategic cost benefit is that it overwhelmingly benefits the other side more than our side. So those are sort of my two responses. But I think from a brass tacks level, I think Democrats face an opportunity here to pass some major legislation that is sorely needed. And, if they don't pass it and then just hope that McConnell goes easy on them later on, I think that's probably not going to. History shows us that that's maybe perhaps not the smartest strategic bet.
Okay, so I want to ask two more questions, and I see that folks are starting to ask questions in the Q&A. That's wonderful. Let me invite others to submit questions in the Q&A. I will keep an eye on it, and I will start drawing questions solely from the Q&A from now on. But let me do two more, and then we'll turn entirely to the audience. So my first question is, okay, but Mitch McConnell's not going to be in the Senate forever. Right? One way or another, Mitch McConnell is not going to be in the Senate forever. And there are those who say, right, especially coming off the sort of Trump era in which we saw norm after norm of democracy sort of fall or constitutional leadership fall, things that, if the majority has 51 votes to get rid of the filibuster, they can legally do. But in fact, it has the effect of ratcheting up tensions and sending democracy, constitutional scholars call this playing constitutional hardball. Political scientists worry that this sends us into a sort of anti-democratic spiral like we've seen in other countries, where the response on the other side to hardball is to just ratchet up the tensions further, to blow through more norms. And the ultimate result is we've slid from a sort of democracy where there's sort of at least institutional forbearance of some kind. We will forbear from exercising all the power we have at all the times we have it because we live in a democracy and we recognize the legitimacy of the other side. Do you worry about that sort of ratcheting up or ratcheting down effect, the sort of norm busting effect in blowing through the filibuster now?
No, I don't, because reforming the filibuster is restoring norms. The Senate was a majority rule body for 200 years of its history. That's the way it was for most of its existence. And as we've talked about, the filibuster was an anomaly that came into existence and was used rarely for all of the 19th century, and then in the first half of the 20th century only on civil rights, and only recently has become the norm. I would argue that the constitutional hardball is the use of the filibuster on everything in a way that was never intended. And I think that getting rid of it would be getting the Senate back to a place where it was supposed to be. And so, the thing is, I think that I take these concerns seriously, but I think that the more important imperative here is to restore a functioning government. I think the greater risk to our democracy right now is that we're sort of in this, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic this week calling it a doom loop. I think that we are, to steal a phrase from my friend Lee Drutman, we're sort of in this spiral where the agenda of the government is diverging ever more greatly away from the will of the people. And when you get rid of the filibuster, what's going to pass the Senate are not far left priorities. You're still going to have to get 51 votes to pass everything. So you're still going to have to get Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema on board, and Bernie Sanders too. So Madison's theory of why majority rule was okay was that anytime, in order to assemble a majority in as big and diverse a country as ours, you're always going to have a broad spectrum of interests represented within that majority. And I think a Democratic Party where you have Joe Manchin and Bernie Sanders in the same majority kind of is a demonstration of that point. So, you're not going to be, if Bernie Sanders put Medicare for all on the floor today, it would get, maybe 10 votes. It's not going to pass. And what will pass and what will be able to muster a majority will be relatively centrist, moderate things. You still have the moderating influence of the overall system that the framers designed of having to pass the House and the Senate and get signed by a president and be upheld by the courts. So, I think the real danger for our democracy right now is that a narrow minority of predominantly white conservatives is allowed to continue to exercise veto power over the agenda of the government. That is why you have a situation today where you have bills that have extraordinarily broad support among the public, 60, 70, 80%, but can't pass the Senate. That's the danger for me, is that the public is sort of pulling their hair out, screaming that we know what the solutions to things like gun violence and climate change and immigration and income inequality are. We have relatively moderate centrist proposals to deal with these things that have broad buy-in from the public, but we can't pass them because of the veto power of a predominantly white conservative minority. That to me is the greater and more imminent threat to our democracy than tyranny of the majority.
Okay, so that's really helpful. And you mentioned Joe Manchin, which lets me get to one of my questions, and I see it, or versions of it in the chat as well, which is, okay, so talk brass tacks. If we buy your case that it is time to get rid of the filibuster, as it appears a growing number of folks in Washington do, Joe Manchin, who is a conservative Democrat in the Senate, the sort of marginal conservative, the most conservative Democrat in the Senate, right? But necessary for the Democrats to win over if they hope to hold even 51 votes to get rid of the filibuster. There are a bunch of sort of halfway proposals for, let's not get rid of the filibuster all the way. Let's do something sort of in the middle. Let's use reconciliation processes like they did in the stimulus when we can. Let's restore the talking filibuster so we at least make folks go to the floor and actually hold the floor. To something more than an email is required to forestall all action in the Senate. There's an argument I've seen about, instead of requiring 60 votes to end debate, you should require the support of a majority of senators who collectively represented a majority of the US population.
Yes.
Right? Count Senate votes by how many people in the United States they represent. Now, there are some constitutional questions arguably attached to that, but realistically, right, having been a former staffer, having been a former campaign staffer, what's the path here? What's the path that you see? And would these sort of partial solutions be useful from your point of view?
Yeah. So politically, I think that, what's going to happen over the coming weeks. I mean, Republicans are currently fond of pointing out to reporters right now that they haven't actually filibustered anything yet. And that's true. The big legislation to pass was the American Rescue Plan, which passed through reconciliation, and Republicans didn't filibuster it. And Manchin's making his noises in Sinema and others. But I think what's going to happen is that right now the question is abstract. There's nothing that's actually getting blocked. What we'll start to see in the coming weeks and months is that, major priorities are going to start to get blocked. I think politically the question becomes much more acute in that situation. And, Joe Manchin has to start answering the question, not just sort of in the abstract, do you like bipartisanship? Yes. But really, why are you standing in the way of passing these sort of core centrist priorities that are the core of the Biden agenda and that are broadly popular in the country? So I think what's going to happen is that the political pressure is going to start ratcheting up to a very high degree, probably unlike anything Manchin's ever seen. And that's going to become a more difficult position for him to maintain. In terms of the reforms, one thing to keep in mind, I think there's a lot of great ideas out there, and I'm very open-minded about what they should be. In the book, I lay out some myself, but I tried to sort of stick to broad principles rather than very specific reforms. One thing to keep in mind tactically is that to do any of these reforms, you have to deploy what we call the nuclear option. The nuclear option refers, and probably we should use a different phrase because it's overly dramatic, but I'm just going to use it for purposes of familiarity here because it's what people think of. That refers to the vote to implement the reform. It's called the nuclear option because it's supposed to be dramatic that you're doing it on a majority rule basis. There's a long history there, but we don't have to worry about it. But it is accepted that when the majority of the Senate decides it wants to do something, that is reflective of the body itself, and that is sort of the trump card in anything regarding Senate rules. So a majority of the Senate can vote at any time to change its rules in any way it wants. It can decide that the sky is green and all sky-related legislation must reflect this fact. It can say that Monday is Tuesday. It can do whatever it wants. But it has to use this thing called the nuclear option to do it. So that raises the question of, if you're going to implement reform and if you're going to deploy this nuclear option, why not go as big as you possibly can? So that's something to consider when you hear all these proposals. When someone proposes a proposal, you think, oh, that's more moderate, maybe Joe Manchin will go for it. You still have to do the nuclear option to do it, and that vote itself is the challenge. I think expanding the use of reconciliation has a lot of merit. you could potentially, create a carve out in reconciliation to expand its rules to apply to voting rights in HR1. I think it's perhaps a slippery slope there, because then you're really starting to create sort of first and second classes of legislation where certain things get to the privilege of passing on a majority and other things don't. For Democrats, we're a big party, big tent party, big coalition. And, it may be hard to explain why we think that some legislation should pass this way while things on climate change, for instance, should still die by filibuster. That poses a political challenge. You could start passing exceptions to the point where everything gets a pass, and that would probably be fine. But reconciliation itself is also a thorny process, and the parliamentarian who's an unelected, basically a staff member who, I respect and they're very smart, but they wield an enormous influence over that. So then you're starting to, probably not healthy to direct legislation through a process where there's one person who gets to sort of unilaterally say that things pass and don't pass. So, if you're going to go through all the trouble of going nuclear, maybe you should do it in a way that is healthier for the institution. The one thing about filibuster reform is that in a way you're sort of clearing the arteries of the institution. Once you do it, you've opened up the possibility that everything can go back to regular order. Things can start going back through committees. They can start coming to the floor with an open amendment process. You've basically, taken a path that is currently clogged and thrown it wide open. And the only change you've made is that now things can pass on a majority instead of 60. But I would argue that it's healthier for the institution to try to, instead of creating all of these workarounds and this sort of Rube Goldberg process, to just, lower the threshold to 50 and then go back to normal. Let things go through committees, let them come up from the floor, let them be amended. The only difference is that they can pass with a majority instead of 60.
So that actually points, there are a lot of great questions in the chat. I don't know that we'll get to all of them. The time is just flying, but so that actually points to another question in the chat, which is, will getting rid of the filibuster move the Senate back closer to regular order, freewheeling style of passing bills, or will centralization by party leadership continue given the forces of polarization? In other words, is getting rid of or I'll rephrase this for myself, right? It is getting rid of the filibuster enough. It's not just, and you mentioned this in your book, right? It's not just the filibuster. It's the fact that we now have, as you pointed out at the beginning, an actual Senate majority leader and Senate minority leader who exercise an enormous amount of control over the agenda. So even if, the moderate senators can develop coalitions to get more things passed, the existing structure will still prevent, without further changes to Senate structure, we'll still be in more or less the same boat.
Right.
We could say, yeah.
Yeah, there's one category of things where it would be helpful in getting the Senate back to more regular order, and that's this sort of like deadline-driven process of legislating, and the use of reconciliation. I mean, these are not healthy ways to operate as a government. Sending things through this complicated reconciliation process that's very closed, where the parliamentarian wields power, and also the fact that we can't ever pass anything until we're facing a government shutdown or a debt ceiling crisis, or the expiration of some major thing, and that is what is required to get 60 votes for anything, and then everything gets wrapped up into these giant mega omnibus packages that are incredibly unhealthy ways to do business. They're a lobbyist dream. It's very easy to stick things into these several thousand-page bills, rather than going through committees. So it would be healthy getting us back to regular order in that. I think being able to pass things on a majority would mean you don't have to run up against an emergency situation to try to get the votes you need to pass something. So on that front, I think it would be helpful. But no, I mean, the partisan structure is a separate thing. And I talk about this in the book. There are other reforms that I think should be made to democratize that process. And things like ending the process of filling the tree, which blocks anybody from being able to offer amendments. But I hope that maybe there's sort of a downstream effect of filibuster reform, where once you get in the habit of reforming the institution, senators will start to think to themselves about other ways they want the institution to be different. Unfortunately, part of the reason we have this top-down structure is that a lot of the rank and file members kind of like it. It makes their lives easier to have the leader set the schedule and to tell them when they need to show up for votes and stuff like that. So it will take a broader effort among senators to decide they want change. But you could see an era of reform where they start to say, we are the custodians of this institution. We have a responsibility to shape it in the ways we want to shape it. And so let's try to get back to some of these first principles here, would be my hope there.
So we've stunningly already hit 5:30, and we're certainly not through all the questions. So let me ask you, if I can, I'll just channel one more, and then thank you for this extraordinary, I wish we had more time conversation. So this is harkening back a little bit to some of the stuff we talked about before, a questioner asks, Mitch McConnell has promised a scorched earth Senate, right? He made this kind of remarkable statement threatening the Democrats if they actually do end the filibuster with, you have no idea what a scorched earth Senate, his language, really looks like. Is there a way to make this worse? As the questioner puts it, what can Senator McConnell realistically do to make the Senate more dysfunctional? Is this a serious concern or not? In other words, could this make matters worse?
Yeah, I mean, when he made that statement, I thought we've been living through a scorched earth Senate for at least 10 years now. Part of the problem is that I think McConnell's, he's deployed most of the biggest weapons in his arsenal. And I think his threats fall a little flat, even with senators, because there's, he's done the worst he can do so far. The type of things that he's threatening to do further are not as bad as the things that he's already doing. There would be a nuisance, but I think that, what they really wouldn't compare to the level of obstruction he's already imposed on the Senate. You saw a little bit of this with the passage of the ARP, where one of the things they did was force the reading of the bills. This is one of the scorched earth things he's threatened. And, it took 10 hours to do it, but they just did it overnight. And then the next day they voted the bill through. And then, Senator Sherrod Brown said this was the best day he'd ever had in the Senate. So there are ways to deal with them. I think they'd be a nuisance. If they get really bad, you can always pass reforms to eliminate some of these tools. And hopefully, Democrats would be willing to do that. But I think that, it's like he's deployed all the nuclear bombs in his arsenal and he's got, a pea shooter left and he's threatening to deploy that too. And I don't think it's that bad. I mean, I think there's a larger threat that to your point about norm breaking, that things get that even worse than they already are. But again, I would say that they're really bad already. And I never want to say in this era that things couldn't get worse on that front. But I would say the upside is that you would restore a semi-functioning government. And so even if sort of personal animosity between senators gets bad, I would take that cost in a trade for the ability to actually have a federal government that is capable of addressing the policy challenges we face today. At a certain point, senators' feelings are just not the primary concern here. We have to pass solutions to global warming, to gun violence. And, I would take a functioning government where senators are cranky over a government where senators are happy and pleased with themselves, but we're not getting anything done.
That actually sounds like a reasonable note on which to end, in which I have otherwise concluded, sounds like maybe we have a little bit more work on democracy yet to do. Yes, it is true. I am biased running the Center for Constitutional Democracy and teaching a course called Presidential Democracy, but nonetheless, I want to thank you for fascinating history, fascinating conversation. Thank you for engaging with us. You have clearly tapped into something because we only scratched the surface of the questions that we received. I hope we'll be able to have you back on some other occasion to talk about it more. Thank you.
I'd love to come back. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining us. I think this event will be available online at some point after the fact, so you can share it around if you wish. I'll see you all next time.
Thanks so much.
Bye, guys. Thank you.